In this video, I'm going to compare two of the best short telephoto lenses available for the Fujifilm X system, Fujifilm's XF 56mm f1.2 RWR and the Viltrox Pro 56mm f1.2. Hi everyone, and welcome to another video. If you've been following me for a while, you might remember that last year I did a huge roundup of the available 56mm autofocus lenses for Fujifilm X. Now, with the release of Viltrox's new 56mm f1.2 Pro lens, that video could probably use an update, but in reality, the only lens that this Viltrox is truly competing with is Fujifilm's XF 56mm f1.2 RWR. Both companies have put their best foot forward with those releases, and it makes sense to compare them head to head, so that's what we're going to do today. If you're interested in comparing some of the other 56mm lenses with slower apertures, I recommend checking out my previous video where I compare things like the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 Air and also the Meiki 55mm f1.4. I'll link that above and below for you, but in this video we're going to be looking at the pinnacle of basically what is available on this focal length, and that is these two lenses here. This is basically the best technology that both companies have available for APS-C lenses. Now, to get this conversation started, I posted a couple of comparisons on my channel a few weeks back to see if viewers could guess which lens was which at social media resolution, essentially, in a very simple setting. Now, these were met with some confident answers, some who were not so sure, and some saying that, well, these images are basically the same. There were no right and wrong answers there, but what I'd really hoped to see was some biases, some interesting reasoning, and just to get people thinking that in this sort of situation where you commonly use one of these lenses, there's really not that much difference between them. And that's exactly what I got, so a big thanks to everyone who shared their thoughts. Now, before we get going though, also a big thanks to anybody who purchased one of these lenses through the links below in my videos. I really appreciate your support, and it helps me keep making videos like this, so thank you very much. Now, what I did find most interesting with the responses that I got, though, were that a lot of people had quite strong convictions about which was sharper or smoother bokeh, which had more 3D pop, and many of you also had strong biases as to which company's lenses produce those sorts of images. And so I really enjoyed getting to know a little bit more about how people think about these two companies and the lenses they produce. Now, before I reveal the answers so that you can know for sure, I'd like to share with you what I see are the major differences between these images that I share. Now, I've had the benefit of the full resolution of the images, so I've been able to pixel peep and really see the differences up close, and you'll get to see that here today as well. So we'll use these images to discuss some of the basic differences between the lenses before we move into some of the bigger differences between them. In the first comparison, the portrait, the differences were somewhat more pronounced than they are in the close-up image that I shared. I shot several with each lens and chose the sharpest one to reduce either of our movements and also missed focus as a variable here. And since these images were shot wide open, there's very little room for error from the lenses when it comes to focusing. The images here are the sharpest one from a batch of 10 from each lens. So, looking closely at the eyes and glasses here, I would say that image A is a little sharper than image B. It's not a huge amount, but maybe enough to be significant for those who use lenses wide open a lot and enjoy zooming in to check focus. Now, if we look at the dress as well, the fine details seem to be just a little bit more defined in image A, as is the case with the buttons that you can see here. On the edge of the necklace, where the contrast is quite strong, this is also better controlled in image A. If we zoom out and consider the colors, I would say that image A has a little more green and image B has a little more magenta. Now, personally, I prefer somewhere in between those two, and that immediately tells me which lens is which, but we'll save that for the end. I also notice a little more smoothness in the overall colors and contrast in image A. It's not quite as punchy as image B to my eye. Any of these overall differences, though, are easy to correct for to your taste in post-production. Now, onto the bokeh. On the right-hand side, I see that image B has some slightly harsher edges to the bokeh than image A, and if we move to the left-hand side, I see a little bit more green fringing around the highlights in image B. These aren't huge differences, and I wouldn't really concern myself with them on any of my shoots. On to a few of your comments then, and then I'll reveal which is which. To my eye, there's quite a big difference in the color of the dress in both images, and personally I prefer the color rendition of image A, so I'll say that the XF 56mm is image A. For my line of work, these images are functionally indistinguishable: portrait, event, and wedding photographer. Now, I also shoot in those genres as well, and I tend to agree here. With this sort of an image, there's absolutely no difference between these two lenses. In my opinion, Photo B is the Fuji. There's a little bit more contrast and the colors are on the warm side. Photo A is more neutral, and hopefully I'm not completely wrong. Now, as I said, there's no right and wrong here, and it's really great to see you trying to reason out which lens you think is which. I'm only on my phone at the moment, but to my eye, on A, the subject seems to pop out a little more, and the out of focus areas are just a little smoother. I have to zoom in to check. Knowing how good and how smooth the Fujifilm 56mm is, the WR at least, if that's the one that you used, I have to guess A is the Fujifilm, B is the Viltrox. Not impossible that the Viltrox could be better, of course, but a little less likely, I guess. I'll be very happy to be wrong though, and save some money. Now, there's a couple of good points here. The Viltrox is significantly cheaper than the Fujifilm, and we will get to that later, but also that I'm viewing on my phone here, and that is where a lot of people are going to view your images. On a phone, on a tablet, on a laptop. That's where images get seen the most, and unless you're making huge prints, you're not really going to see any massive differences with an image like this. Photo B is the one I prefer, and decisively so. However, I don't know if it's Fuji or Viltrox. Both pictures may have lots of background blur, but only one has that 3D pop to it, at least for me. I've never used the XF 56mm, nor the Viltrox 56mm, but I'd say that image A is Fuji, knowing that Fujifilm strives for nice, realistic colors and smooth rendering. The Viltrox gives high contrast, sharpness, muted color, and rich bokeh, which is what I think I'm seeing in image B. Again, strong conviction here, and I really like to see people trying to dissect an image and decide what they like about it and which lens might work for them. So, the grand reveal. Image A is the XF 56mm and image B is the Viltrox Pro 56mm. So, on to the next image. In this close-up, I also see a couple of small differences. They're not as pronounced as the last image though. Firstly, if we zoom into the face of the Buddha statue and look at the right shoulder where the shawl comes down, I see a hair more detail there. Not enough that I'd really worry about either lens, but there is a small difference there, with A being sharper to my eye. I'd use either on a client shoot based on this. Next, if we visit the hands, we can see some chromatic aberration around the fingers and also the elbow. Image B shows slightly more chromatic aberration in this case. It's slightly larger and more saturated to my eye. Again, not a huge difference, and this is rarely going to become an issue for most people. Now, if we visit the bokeh in the top left of the image, we can see another subtle difference. To my eye, image A is slightly smoother, while image B feels just a little more nervous. Again, I'd work with either type of bokeh on a client shoot without issue. Now, as with the previous image, here are a few of your comments ahead of the reveal. I'm going to guess A is the XF. It looks ever so slightly smoother in the out of focus areas, and I'm guessing the Viltrox might not match, but honestly I'd be happy with either. I'm going to go with A as the Viltrox. I have the feeling that the Viltrox is a tad bit sharper. So what's interesting here is that Viltrox have really built themselves a reputation of producing very, very sharp lenses in a budget bracket. And the assumption here is that, well, this one is sharper, therefore it must be Viltrox, which is very interesting. The Fujifilm XF is picture B. The highlights and shadows are darker, as are the greens and yellows. So in general, we have a bit more contrast and 5% less sharpness. That's a very precise value, but I definitely agree that image B is a little bit softer. I like B slightly more. I'm not sure which lens it was. Pure guess is B was using the XF. Whatever the answer is, it's not a $600 difference based on these photos. I've owned around 8 different XF lenses, and the 56mm is hands down my favorite. However, Fujifilm needs to reevaluate the prices of their lenses if they're going to compete with Viltrox. And again, if you haven't already guessed, A was shot on the XF lens. So, as you can see, the answers here were quite polarized. Some people were sure, others weren't, and some biases showed through. So again, thank you all for participating in this little experiment. I want to re-emphasize that there are no right or wrong answers here. Nobody made any mistakes. It was all about revealing the idea that we can have preconceptions about certain things before we know enough about them. And these little 1920 pixel images were not really enough information. So I love the fact that you guys dug in and tried to actually decide which lens was which, so thanks again. So what have we learnt so far? Well, wide open, the XF is a little bit sharper than the Viltrox, and this is true both in the center of the frame and in the extreme corners in my testing. By f2 though, they're functionally the same and both produce very similar detail. Now here's how that plays out in real life scenario, like a Head and Shoulders portrait. Honestly, without pixel peeping, both of these would be absolutely fine for me and I'd have no issues delivering either of them to a client. But if we zoom into the eyes, the XF is just a little bit sharper to my eye, but the Viltrox has slightly higher contrast, giving the feeling of sharpness until we look very, very closely. Still, both are great. Looking at the same scene shot at f2 though, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference, so if it's detail you're looking for, there's functionally very little difference between them once you start stopping down. We've also seen that the XF lens is, like most Fujinon lenses, a little cooler and greener in its rendition, even though the XF 56mm is one of the warmer Fujinon lenses. The Viltrox is a little warmer and has a bit of a magenta bias, and personally when I process images from the XF lens, I always add a little magenta, and when working on images from the Viltrox, I always add a little green. That's a personal preference, but neither of these lenses takes that step out of my post-processing. Finally, we've seen that the bokeh from the two lenses is very similar in a simple portrait or a close-up like the images we've seen so far. The Viltrox produces bokeh that is a hair less smooth to my eye, but I would be happy to use both of them for work like this. But it's not simple scenes like this where the best lenses shine. It's when the scene gets more complex, higher contrast, or in backlit situations where we see bigger differences. So let's dig into the lenses just a little bit deeper. The first area we'll see some major discrepancies between these lenses is in their autofocus capabilities. They're quite different and they both have their pros and cons. And also, since I was asked in the comments of my review about using this lens for a talking head video, I'm going to film this section on the Viltrox so we can see how that pans out. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments below. Now, I apologize for the tight framing here. That's basically a function of the fact that I cannot get this camera any further back than it already is. The XF lens has the most current and advanced version of Fujifilm's DC motor. Now, as we all know, DC motors are known for producing a little more noise and hunting back and forth a little more than other motor types. But this one really isn't actually as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. It focuses extremely quickly when using AFS and rarely hunts at all unless used in extreme backlight. For static subjects, like in many portraits, this is absolutely as good as it needs to be, and I've been using it since its release without any issues at all. It's exceptionally accurate, and since Fujifilm themselves produced the lens, it's as well integrated into their autofocus system as a lens can get. The Viltrox, on the other hand, uses their voice coil motor, and that's absolutely silent and incredibly swift once the system kicks in. This is especially true in AFC when tracking moving subjects. Take, for example, this set of images from my wife swinging erratically on a misaligned swing. There is absolutely no way the XF lens would keep up with this and nail every image like the Viltrox did. Out of 150 or so images, I only saw 4 that were out of focus. So in situations like this, the Viltrox is the clear winner. However, as I mentioned in my review, this lens can take just a little bit more time to sort of warm up and start focusing. It also resets itself completely if you release the focus button before it has achieved focus. In addition to that, as you can see here, the system often needs to wobble about to achieve focus, even when refocusing on the same area again and again. So hopefully these are just sort of teething issues and Viltrox can figure out how to make the most of their integration into the Fujifilm autofocus system. But as of now, these are the issues that I see. To pit the two lenses against each other directly, I did a quick and dirty tracking test in a local park with my wife just to see how the two lenses felt to use in a common situation, like with having a subject walking towards the camera, something that most wedding photographers are going to face at every session, and something that I commonly do with my couples and families. I had the camera set to release priority so that the shutter would only be released after acquiring focus, and I used the XH2S on a tripod to give both lenses the best chance of success. Over the course of the 10-meter walk, the Viltrox produced 54 images, 5 of which I'd count as slightly out of focus. The XF lens produced 43 images, 4 of which were slightly out of focus, and 1 was just a little more out of focus, but still not a complete miss. in addition, the Viltrox gives the experience that it's really nailing focus. It doesn't hunt around, and it looks like one of those sort of autofocus ads that the manufacturers produce, with autofocus boxes just sort of sticking to the subject like glue with no autofocus wobbles at all. The XF, on the other hand, can be seen making its tiny little back and forth movements while focusing. So I'd say that if you're going to make use of a 56mm lens to track moving subjects, especially ones that are moving quickly or erratically, the Viltrox is absolutely the way to go. However, for static or slow predictable subjects, I'd say the XF lens has the edge right now. It just nails focus every time with static subjects and is slightly sharper, which really helps to sell the images when they are in focus. I wanted to take the bokeh testing a little further with a couple of head-to-head tests on a tripod to see what the differences might be. In my local park, there's a scene with sort of several layers behind and in front of the subject, and so I decided to test it there and see if we could reveal any major differences. Now, unfortunately, we've had very cloudy weather every single time I've had a window to test these lenses, so we're not looking at a backlit scene that would expose bare any serious issues with the lenses. But we'll look at some backlight separately in the next section. For now, let's take a look at these two side by side. Now, when we look at images in full like this, I see absolutely no difference here that would make me use one lens over the other. Perhaps the fall off in the XF image is a little bit more pleasing to me. It's softer and helps the subject pop a little bit more out of the frame to me. Stopping the lenses down to f2, it's more of the same. I see no real difference here at this aperture. Both feel pretty much the same to me, aside from the color and contrast differences. At f2.8, it's more of the same. I see very little difference at this magnification. Now, if we pop back to the first image shot wide open and look at the leaves in the top right, I much prefer the XF image. It's a little softer and smoother in its rendition. If we then look at the grasses on the bottom left, it's much of the same story again. The XF just renders things a little bit more smoothly. But remember, these are just tight crops of bokeh. How often do you or your viewers actually zoom in to check the quality of bokeh? There's a subtle difference, but is it actually meaningful? When it comes to backlit scenes, we see some quite big differences in the rendering of these two lenses. Now, both of them focus reasonably well in backlight, but they're definitely less confident than they are in, say, front light or soft light or side light or something like that. But neither lens is completely immune to flare and ghosting, and they do handle it very differently. The coatings on the XF lens do a great job of handling ghosting, and there's very little of it. We do see a little flare that reduces contrast, but it's also very well handled. And it does have some gorgeous effects when used wide open, and this is one of the reasons that I absolutely adore this lens, and also the GF 110mm f2 for the GFX system as well. But onto a nightmare situation for both lenses. We'll take a quick look at two sets of images here, and they're from the same situation, but with a slightly different light position in the frame. In this first image, you can see that while it's not horrendous in this case, the Viltrox does lose a little more contrast when we're shooting into the light. We also see a similar ghost appearing at the bottom of a frame from both lenses, with the Viltrox showing just a little more saturation in that area. When we zoom out, you see a major red arch across the Viltrox image, and this is the sort of thing that you really need to watch out for and either place it carefully in your frame or change the composition to remove it altogether. In this second image, where the light is a little bit stronger and coming right down the barrel of the lens, we see that both lenses suffer a little more than before. The XF lens also begins to show that red arch across the top of the frame, but it's a lot softer and less dominant in the composition than the Viltrox one. Again, we see a little more ghosting from the Viltrox lens, but the big difference to my eye is the amount of contrast lost in the Viltrox image. Now, let's be clear, this isn't the sort of situation that I shoot a lot of my portraits in, and slight angle changes can really help to deal with this on either lens, but I wanted to push them to their limits to see the differences in the coatings that are on the lenses. I'll show you the image from my Viltrox 56mm review here once more, just to show you what happens when the coatings are really pushed to their limits. As I've said many times before, I absolutely love flare and ghosting in my lenses for creative purposes, but I don't want it all of the time. Now, this is one of the reasons that I love the little TT Artisan 56mm. It flares an insane amount, but it's light enough that you can add it to your bag in addition to a better quality 56mm for when you want to make use of the flare. This Viltrox though got a bit of a strike in my review for its sometimes extreme flare. Now, as you've seen in the examples I've shown, the flare and ghosting just take over the image quite significantly and don't really contribute anything to the feeling of it. For me, this is the kind of flare and ghosting that I want to avoid. And honestly, if the lens didn't have the word Pro written on the side of it, I'd likely have been a little bit more lenient. But to me, the word Pro denotes that it's the best it can be in all situations and can be relied on to create high quality images in any light. Clearly, this one is just not for every situation for everyone. And that's why I'd recommend the XF lens for anyone who shoots into backlight quite often. It shows similar effects, but they're at fewer angles and they're much easier to avoid when you don't want them. So it should be clear by now that the Viltrox 56mm f1.2 Pro, as good as it is, won't be replacing the XF 56mm 1.2 RWR for me. Now, there are quite a few reasons for that, and they may or may not be relevant to you, but here they are in no particular order. The Viltrox being slightly heavier is a factor for me. Now, it doesn't matter so much when it's one lens of 3 on a portrait shoot that lasts for an hour or two, but I also shoot 12, 14-hour long corporate events, and by the end of a day like that, a few grams here and there makes all the difference, especially when you're taking 5 or 6 lenses and a flash and all those sorts of things. Now, there's also a lot of high contrast edges like microphone stands and projector screens in corporate events like that, and those are absolute magnets for the chromatic aberration that the Viltrox displays. Flare and ghosting are also issues for me personally. Now, I love flare and I love using all sorts of wild effects in my personal work to create interesting scenes, but when it comes to my client work, I tend to like a bit of a more controlled, predictable type of flare and ghosting. Now, if you've seen my reviews of the GF 110mm f2 and the XF 56mm f1.2 RWR, you'll know what I mean. The example on screen is the type of flare that I absolutely love working with at my client shoots. It doesn't affect skin tones and contrast in any significant way. It just sort of creates this lovely wash from one side of the image, and the Fujifilm lenses do this oh so well. It's for these reasons that the XF lens is the choice for me, and I can live with Fujifilm not dropping a linear motor into the mix. This is a dependable and predictable lens, and it's plenty fast enough for the work that I do. For my client shoots, that's what I really need. The Viltrox, though, is going to suit a lot of people better. If you're working in less strong backlight or with more dynamic subjects, the Viltrox could certainly be a better choice for you. There's also the fact that the Viltrox is less than half the price of the XF at full retail pricing. So what do you really get for that extra money? Now, as we've seen, the XF lens is a little bit sharper, it has slightly better control over chromatic aberration, and has slightly better coatings for flare and ghosting prevention. It's also slightly lighter in the hand. With the XF lens, you also gain access to Fujifilm's warranty, which if you live reasonably close to one of their service centers is a really big plus for that lens. You also get the guarantee that, as long as Fujifilm are still producing cameras, you've got a lens that will be updated in order to be compatible with any of those future cameras. Viltrox, being a third-party manufacturer, have a harder time providing all of these services, especially at the lower price point that they charge. Now, that might change in the future, but for now, Viltrox service can only be done through Viltrox directly, so if there's an issue with your lens, it's going to need to go back to Viltrox. Also, given that Viltrox is producing lenses for several different mounts, each of which has dozens of different cameras available for it, there's no guarantee that your lens and camera combination in the future is going to be future-proof if Fujifilm decides to update their autofocus system in a way that current Viltrox lenses are incompatible with. Of course, these are worst-case scenarios and they may never come to fruition, but they are concerns nonetheless. If things like service center availability, a higher chance of future-proofing, and the aforementioned subtle image quality differences are things that are meaningful to you, the XF lens is an absolute no-brainer. If not, as you've hopefully seen so far, the Viltrox lens is a really good contender for anyone's kit. It's an excellent lens and is so close to the Fujifilm XF lens in build quality and image quality for most people that it'll be functionally the same lens. So kudos to both Viltrox and Fujifilm for producing top-tier lenses in the XF system and making it hard to choose. Hopefully this has been useful to you, and if you've made it this far, a big thanks for watching. I hope you'll enjoy a few more images from both lenses in the upcoming slideshow, and thanks again for joining me here.